Hello, how's it going? And I'm back to talk about a widely popular alternative history and its downsides. That being, what if Gore won 2000 and 2004? Now, many consider this alternative history to be better than our own timeline due to the failures of the Bush administration and the countless overseas wars that many feel like we shouldn't have been involved in, such as Iraq and Afghanistan, and the blame that gets put on the US for destabilizing these regions, leading to the rise of groups like ISIS. However, as the title suggests, I'm here to talk about the rather negative aspects that affect such a Gore presidency and why it leads to a very tense 2020s and potentially even a World War III. Now, one thing I do want to note is that this video is largely going to go over Gore's foreign policy and not his internal policy. His internal policy is something else to be discussed, as they are seen in better light due to the fact that Bush's pretty much failed. However, for this video, I'm going to be talking about his foreign policy. His internal policy is a whole different subject, but do keep it in the rest of your mind that I am going to be talking about his foreign policy for the remainder of this video. We good? Alright, let's get to work. The first thing we do need to discuss is that 9/11 and the invasion of Afghanistan is pretty much unavoidable. Whether Bush or Gore, it's pretty much going to play out the exact same. Now, I have heard a few saying that, oh, if Gore had gotten in power, 9/11 wouldn't have happened, but that is pretty false. The CIA and FBI were grossly inefficient during this time, and there wasn't really anything that shook them awake until 9/11 happened. Now, don't take this as me blaming Gore for 9/11 or the invasion of Afghanistan. Like I said, that's pretty much unavoidable no matter who you have in office during the time. Unless you go back to the Clinton administration and take away, well, Al-Qaeda earlier, there's no way that you can actually prevent 9/11 in the 2000s. All the pieces were already moving into place by then, and like I said, unless you go back in time and change it, there's nothing that can really be done to stop it. So, no, I'm not blaming Gore for 9/11 or the invasion of Afghanistan and the absolute quagmire that turns into. Now, another thing I've heard about this different invasion of Afghanistan is that Osama bin Laden would have been captured and murdered earlier. And while this might be true, as Gore likely wouldn't be preoccupied with any other foreign intervention, at the same time, if Osama bin Laden sees the increased US attention on Afghanistan, he might even try to flee earlier. Now, again, this isn't a guarantee, but it still is a possibility. Now, regardless, if you're able to capture Osama bin Laden, it doesn't change the fact that the invasion of Afghanistan likely goes the exact same as our timeline. I'm sorry, but just because Gore is in office does not mean he's going to be able to stop the Taliban, and eventually the US is going to be forced to pull out. And with it, the Taliban have a window open to seize power. Around the same time, we need to also go to a different event, being the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Now, I'm going to clarify this. The 2003 invasion of Iraq did not happen because of 9/11. Iraq didn't have a whole lot to do with 9/11. And now, the reason why they invaded Iraq was largely due to the so-called weapons of mass destruction hiding in Iraq at the time. This is due to faulty intelligence within the intelligence agencies and the fact that this was largely let through to President Bush without any real fact-checking. Now, whether or not the same thing happens to Gore can be debated, but if it does, then it's likely due to his more dovish foreign policy that he requires an investigation of Iraq to see if they really have this or if this is just faulty intelligence. And because, like our timeline, this is faulty intelligence, the 2003 invasion of Iraq likely doesn't happen. And this has massive ripple effects. Now, Saddam, before he died, was actually still somewhat young, around in his 60s, meaning that at the very most, he has a few years to go wild in Iraq before eventually one of his sons takes over the position. And mind you, his sons are practically the devil reincarnate, so I can tell you this is gonna go absolutely great for the Middle East. Now, with this window of opportunity open to Saddam, since the US isn't going to invade as there's no such thing as WMDs in the country, Where does Saddam's Iraq go from here? Well, I can tell you right now, it is hardly going to be peaceful. Now, what I can tell you is that with this window of opportunity open, Saddam likely knows that the US will not invade due to their more dovish president, the fact that they're already bogged down and focused on Afghanistan, and the fact that Saddam still has dreams of dominating the Persian Gulf. He likely takes this as a window of opportunity, like previously mentioned, and his sons are very likely to follow in his footsteps. Now, there is nothing official as to what Saddam was going to do if the US had left him alone in 2003. However, knowing Saddam Hussein, his relations with other countries, his long standing ambitions, and his family tree, it's very likely that, knowing that the US won't come after him, he attempts to go on a reconquest, starting with the little pimple, Kuwait. Now, maybe I'm overestimating Gore's dovishness, and it's very possible he might actually respond to an Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. In doing so, he might try to form a coalition like Bush did and go after Iraq, leading to a similar outcome of our timeline. But if my predictions are correct and he decides to sit out the Iraq war, then we have a completely different future going forwards. Now, as Saddam goes on the reconquest, he will eventually overrun Kuwait and annex it. In doing so, not only does this give him a bunch of oil, but it also leaves him in a bit of a position for a reconquest and to fulfill his dreams. Now, with no one really coming to their aid, the Kuwaiti government is pretty much annexed into the Iraqi one, not only subjugating the people of Kuwait to the horrific conditions of Saddam's Iraq, but also telling Iraq that the US and, by extension, foreign powers aren't really going to intervene on the matter, leaving him up for different adventures across the Middle East, his next target likely being Syria. Syria being weak isn't the only issue they have to face, as in 2003 they would face some serious instability via Assad oppressing political reforms, and Israel began airstriking Syria in October. Now, likely seeing this instability as an opportunity, Saddam could instead line his army up on the border and invade Syria. In doing so, we can expect that Syria likely collapses. While the war may take a while, there's no way in hell Syria is going to be able to defeat Saddam without significant support, which they lack. So we can expect the war to not last too long, and at the end of the day, Iraq will become victorious, likely annexing some Iraqi majority lands, while also leaving the rest of Syria into an Iraqi puppet regime, which is likely to face instability, but under the rule of Saddam, riots and whatnot are likely to be brutally crushed. After doing this, Saddam will likely cool for a bit. He has achieved a few conquests, and now he needs to strengthen his diplomatic end. First off, he likely tries to bind Transjordan to him economically. Transjordan and Saddam's Iraq had been more than just partners. They were economic, politically, and more or less just on good terms with one another, and Saddam will likely take advantage of this, seeing as how Jordan is in no way to resist any of Iraq's demands without facing invasion. It's likely that Iraq may attempt to economically puppet Jordan, which they don't really have any other choice to do but accept. The next thing we need to take into regard is, well, Lebanon, or rather Hezbollah, as Saddam is not at all a fan of Hezbollah. Now, the main reason for his hatred of Hezbollah comes from their relationship with Iran, and I don't think I need to explain why Saddam Hussein hates Iran. In doing so, it is very likely that Saddam could attempt to invade Lebanon, subjugate it, turn it into a puppet, and then physically deal with Hezbollah himself in order to counter Iran's influence in the region. In doing so, Saddam will likely enter a guerrilla warfare with Hezbollah, but with Iran unable to support them and a lack of an international reaction, it's very likely Saddam comes out on top of this conflict. This is also important because this has him border Israel and Palestine. And if you know anything about Saddam, you know that he is a big ally of the Palestinians. This is also important because at the beginning of the millennia, Israeli and Palestinian relations began to break down, leaving open a opportunity. Now, in the case of Israeli and Palestinian relations breaking down and a potential war sparking over it, we could see Saddam either intervening on the side of the Palestinians, leading to a Palestinian state, or he sits on the sidelines and decides to supply the Palestinians instead with his allies. Now, unlike Bush, who actually made a roadmap for peace within Israel, I can't really see that happening with Gore or Saddam. Now, unlike the majority of his foreign policy views, Gore was actually a pretty big proponent of a Israel-US alliance, and in doing so, he'll probably have something to say about this war breaking out. However, the reason why I don't see a roadmap for peace taking place here is that both sides are likely unable to compromise with each other. Saddam, being an ally of the Palestinians, likely wishes to kick Israel out of the Middle East wholly, while Gore, a huge fan of Israel, likely wants to push Saddam out of their ally. However, that is only if Saddam decides to directly intervene into Israel, and if he knows that Gore is a strong proponent of the US Israeli alliance, then he likely sits on the sidelines and sticks to supporting the Palestinians in their struggle, which might actually result in a eventual Palestinian victory. Now, I could be wrong here, and Gore actually does decide to supply the Israelis despite his dovish foreign policy. Now, if this is the case, then we can expect the war to turn into, what our modern day Israel Palestinian conflict is, as in a grueling slog in which neither side seems to be winning and or achieving their goals. However, if Saddam's support is decisive, we could see Israel's front lines begin to crumble in the region. And if Gore really does decide to sit this out, or if he arrives too little too late, Israel might fully be defeated and evicted from the Middle East as a whole. Now, if this is the case, which I will be following for the rest of this video, this is going to send shockwaves throughout the international community. One of the US's longest standing allies has not just fallen, but fallen to a regime backed by a primary enemy of the US. This likely gives Russia, China, India, and other superpowers some funny ideas. Now, you also shouldn't expect any foreign intervention. First off, because Israel is surrounded by allies of Saddam and Egypt, which isn't a huge fan of Israel, but also because Palestine is largely Muslim, as is the rest of the Middle East. However, after this defeat, Palestine isn't free. Palestine likely becomes economically bounded to Iraq, seen as they're largely weak and can't really stand up on their own, especially if they're forced to recover from a war. They're going to be forced to rely on Saddam, further binding them to his regime. Then, after defeating one of his longest standing rivals, Saddam likely turns his attention to the final obstacle standing in his way and the road to the final confrontation, the Second Iranian-Iraq War. Now, if I'm correct and a second Iran-Iraq war springs up, we can expect Iraq to do much better. First off, not only does he have more allies supporting him here, second off, even enemies of Saddam's regime in Iraq aren't fans of Iran's regime in Iran. Another thing I should mention is that not only is Iraq's army just sharpened and overall modernized throughout their countless invasions of smaller countries, it's also incredibly likely that this Iran has not learned from the past Iran-Iraq war, as when looking from the 1980s all the way to now, they have not really faced any other outside invasion until, now, while Iraq has been on the warpath. It's also extremely likely that, seeing this road of conquest, Iran tries to prepare for such an inevitable conflict. And if that's the case, we can expect Saddam to struggle. However, if, say, Iran does actually falter in such a war, we can expect that Iraq actually does try to do something similar to a caucus strategy, and instead of going for a stupid push towards something like Tehran, they they instead focus down south to the Iranian oil fields by the Persian Gulf. If they are able to sufficiently capture these and be able to survive a potential counteroffensive, then it is very likely that the fate of Iran is doomed. They have lost their oil, they have no allies of their own, and there is no one supporting them. America also isn't likely to intervene, because first off, Iran and America very much do not like each other, and second off, as Gore is still entangled in Afghanistan, he's also likely just focusing on other matters, especially because around the time this would have been taking place, it's re-election season. And with the mess ups in the Middle East, he has to try and convince America to vote for him in the election. So it's very likely that in order to win back support, Gore does not fully intervene, but likely places tariffs or sanctions on Iraq, hoping to slow down their military industry and bring the war to a grinding halt, which of course it will not do. Now, the war could still take years, but at the end of the day, Iraq holds the crucial oil fields that Iran used to have, and without a major manufacturing component, Iran is likely to falter, leading to further Iraqi gains. It's even possible that uprisings within Iran do happen, but Saddam is likely to not respect these and just uses them as a short sighted opportunity to once more break down Iran's capabilities to fight the war. Eventually, after moving in and capturing the cities within the revolts are happening in, he likely brutally suppresses them. And with this set, Iran likely runs out of any energy to continue and capitulates to Saddam's Iraq. With that done, Iran will have been completely destroyed. In place of the Ayatollah or whatever current government takes form will be an Iraqi puppet regime, and Iraq will have seized major territories. In doing so, likely seizing major oil-rich territories, making Iraq a oil-rich country, forcing other countries that are reliant on oil to get along with Iraq, or they face oil shortages. Saudi Arabia, likely spooked by such an action, likely requests for more US forces and or bases on their territory, ensuring that the US will get involved if Saddam seeks conquest within Saudi Arabia. The US, or Gore, will likely accept such an offer, especially since Gore needs to wake up on the foreign policy stage, as Iraq is not the only issue he's going to be facing. But more on that later. With such a conquest of Iran secured, Saddam can focus on, supplying other regimes, such as India and Azerbaijan. Saddam was a decent fan of Azerbaijan, and he's likely to supply it through his puppet regime in Iran. If this is the case, we can likely expect that, Azerbaijan not only becomes economically tied to Iraq, as they're hopelessly dependent on them for supplies, it's also likely that if any conflict breaks out within Armenia, that Azerbaijan, feeling emboldened by the Iraqi support, might actually seek themselves. Azerbaijan is surely to win. Now, with such a victory secured, Armenia is practically helpless to defend itself against the much larger Azerbaijan, and in doing so, they are likely forced to align themselves with Azerbaijan to avoid further subjugation. Not only has Saddam secured another victory against the US, he has also connected himself to what might be another one of his allies, Russia, which, noticing the lack of a US presence, will actively become more aggressive. But again, we'll revisit that in a little bit, as we have to make a detour to India. Saddam, near the end of his reign, was actually a bit of a fan of India, siding with them over the Kashmir dispute and beginning to link up. Assuming this trend doesn't change, he might actually support them in any other further conflict with the Pakistanis over Kashmir. If this is the case, we can expect India to win against Pakistan, leading to further gains along Kashmir. This is important, as if this is the case, then China will have lost any land connection to Pakistan, meaning that if they are to support them, they're going to have to go through Afghanistan, a country who doesn't really like China and who will be brought up again in a potential future video. There's also potential that through his Iranian puppet regime, if war between Pakistan is to break out over Kashmir, well, Saddam might just intervene on India's side and decide to invade southern Pakistan. Or hell, he might even invade Afghanistan whenever the US leaves, hoping to counteract the Taliban, who are, well, going to take power. And he very much does not like the Taliban. No big shocker. While it is true, Saddam was indeed allies of the Taliban for a certain amount of time, he also largely found himself in this position via circumstance and not out of love. He was ideologically opposed to the Taliban, and he only really liked them because they were fighting against the US, which, shocker, had just invaded his country. Now, once again, this is a hypothetical. He is unlikely to invade Afghanistan due to the US presence there, and a war with Pakistan is likely to be avoided as India wins in Kashmir. With this set, Iraq can firmly sit back and enjoy as, well, their rule over the Middle East is largely unchallenged. However, the US is drawing lines in the sand, similar to Germany, about where their expansion is open and where it is not. Now, taking a break from the Middle East, we have Putin's Russia, and as I'm sure you know, well, Putin, he does really want to bring back Russia on the world stage. And with a Gore presidency who is unlikely to expand NATO in the same way Bush did, he is going to be in wonders. See, a little known fact about the Bush administration is that he actually got 7 nations into NATO. That's right, 7 nations. And these weren't all small nations. These were largely decently big nations too. Bulgaria, the Baltics, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia, all around 2004. Gore, unlikely to expand NATO due to the lack of a threat from the east, is at the very least not going to expand as quickly, and at worst, is completely going to neglect the stuff, leading to further Russian influence in regions like the Baltics, or Transnistria, Moldova, or hell, even Ukraine. It's very likely that without any US protection, the Baltics may fall to Russian subjugation and get their boots firmly placed in the CSTO camp. Hell, Georgia might actually be on the chopping block here, and in doing so, the outsider regions could be annexed into Russia proper. If this is the case, Putin will be absolutely emboldened by these victories, as the slow US has failed to respond to him and hasn't implemented any restrictions against him at all. And in doing so, this leaves him open for expansion elsewhere, primarily against his main target, Ukraine. The difference between our timeline is that if Putin decides to, well, go after Ukraine, there is truly nothing stopping him. The US does not have their boot firmly placed in Eastern Europe, making it harder for them to, well, help Ukraine in a potential war against Russia. Now, I'm not saying that Ukraine is going to roll over without any support. It's very likely that they do receive some amount of support. However, it's also very likely that it isn't a unified response like our timeline with a further weakened NATO, and in doing so, leaving more room open for further Russian expansion along the front line. Even better for Putin, since Saddam has secured Azerbaijan, aka Baku, Saddam can largely send oil to Russia, and again, since Russia is a firm ally of Saddam, they will have no problem supplying him in any future conflict. And, well, again, Azerbaijan, a strong oil rich region, can likely free up any oil sanctions that get placed on Russia as a result. This means that with a, well, slower NATO response and a much stronger Russia, we could see an even earlier invasion of Ukraine without a very strong president in the White House to counter Russia's expansion. Now, again, I'm not saying that Putin is guaranteed to invade Ukraine. Okay, who am I kidding? He is. But again, he could easily do it earlier than our timeline, seeing the weakened US response, especially since, thanks to Saddam, most of the world's attention will be focused on the growing superpower in the Middle East and not on Russia, who is currently making little territorial expansion. Another interesting side effect is that with a lack of a US presence in a place like Romania, there's truly nothing stopping Russia from supporting the Transnistrians to an eventual breakaway, and in doing so, we get another firm Russian ally in the region. And again, NATO is not there to supply the Moldovans. Though, weirdly enough, this might actually be able to award the Moldovans a membership into NATO and by extension the EU, as their outstanding border crisis is now gone. However, if Transnistria is, well, able to break away, then it's very likely that Putin, now seeing his opportunity, gets ready to envelop Ukraine now that they're surrounded by CSTO allies and a lack of, well, NATO in the area. Yes, NATO is in Poland and Hungary, but again, with a lack of NATO in Romania, Moldova, the Baltics, and Bulgaria, they're going to have a much harder time supplying Ukraine than they did in our timeline. That's why I largely find it likely in a timeline like this for Ukraine to be invaded much, much earlier, possibly around, well, 2006 or 2007, and we can expect this invasion to start off similar to our timeline, while the US does nothing but launch sanctions in response to the Russian actions. And by the way, in case you're wondering, I'm keeping Gore around for the 2000s, as it's likely that his internal policies are popular enough to award him a victory in 2004. However, with this invasion set, it's very likely Ukraine does not perform as good as they did in our timeline, eventually being driven further back than our timeline's front lines, and at worst cases, capitulating in about a year or so. In doing so, they are utterly subjugated by the Russians. The majority of this region, right around here, will be annexed directly into Russia, while now they can form a border connection to Transnistria, which, seeing how small it is compared to Russia, will likely join the country in the future, while the remnants of Ukraine are likely folded under a Russian puppet. After this, we can expect the West to shit themselves and for them to attempt to expand into places like Romania and Bulgaria. In the chaos, Serbia might use the moment to either further align themselves with the Russians or perhaps even push into Kosovo. In doing so, it's likely that, well, they aren't stopped and they're able to annex it. But we'll return to Serbia later. After this action, NATO is largely shitting themselves, mostly because, well, they have just handed Eastern Europe to Russia by being slow to expand and assuming that, well, they were still dominant. But now, this rising Iraq, this rising Russia, have largely shooken them awake, and has also completely doomed the Democrats' chance at a 2008 election, meaning that Obama never gets into office, and US politics are forever altered as a result. Now, Asia might actually be the calmest out of all the continents here. China might actually just, well, start some border conflicts with Vietnam to test the waters of how the US interacts with Asia, and once finding that there is little response, they do indeed seize some land from Vietnam after winning some border conflicts. But that's about it. I don't really see China going on the aggressive war path here. They likely instead just stay patient and focus on rebuilding their economy and more or less focus on aiding, well, Russia, but also likely get into some form of conflict with Iraq due to the fact that Saddam, in this scenario, is an ally of the Indians. Could actually see some heated diplomatic moments between, well, Iraq and China, as China wants to get Kashmir and support the Pakistanis in the region, while also weakening India. But once again, Iraq is allies with India. Now, with all this tension and the failure on the US to work on the world stage, has likely led to a Republican winning in 2008. So, McCain gets in office, right? Well, it's not likely. McCain, I find it very unlikely for him to actually win 2008, especially since we haven't really done anything to prevent the Bushes from running again. Who's to say someone like Dick Cheney, George W. Bush, Donald Rumsfeld, Jeb Bush, or hell, even Donald Trump attempts to run for president now after seeing the brutal failure of the Gore administration on the world scene, leading to the US's enemies gaining a leg up. Also, not to mention, there is no failure on the end of the Bush administration or anyone from it. So, you wouldn't have anyone really objecting to Dick Cheney, as there's no Iraq war to be blamed on him or anything like that. Hell, Gore might actually receive more flank than the Bush administration did in our timeline for allowing the Middle East to be subjugated to a brutal dictatorship like that of Iraq's, while failing to deal with the Taliban in Afghanistan, Putin's Russia in Eastern Europe, and a growing economic China, which threatens, well, Asia. Now, with this all set, it's also likely the US commits harder to Afghanistan, as I find it incredibly unlikely Gore pulls America out of Afghanistan in the 2000s, especially with, like previously stated, the massive quagmire that mess turns into. Now, with this set, I do find it likely in such a tense timeline for World War III to break out. Don't know how, don't know when, don't know who, but World War III by some merit does break out. On one side, we have the US and its allies, encompassing most of Europe, the North Americas, and the majority of, well, Asian countries, while on the other side, you have Russia, Eastern Europe, Iraq and their massive, well, bloc, and of course, China and North Korea. And if you ask me, the favorites to win here are the Eastern Alliance, as I'll be calling them, aka Russia, China, and Iraq. Now, don't get me wrong, in such a timeline, World War III might itself be avoided, but I consider it very likely that something like World War III is going to happen here. And I won't go too in depth with the war side, but rather focus on the outcomes. If the Eastern Alliance does win, we can expect a unironic restoration of some form of Eastern Bloc, as Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Moldova, Bulgaria, and Serbia all fall under, well, either Russian administration or, well, Russian influence, like Serbia. Hey, Serbia might actually take the opportunity of a World War III to invade Kosovo, reconquer it, then split off the Republic of Srpska from Bosnia, then, in doing so, basically take over the rest of Bosnia before eventually restoring the rest of Yugoslavia. Especially if NATO loses the conflict, we can expect them to likely be kicked out of the Balkans, as Serbia is largely a fan of Russia, and in doing so, I'm sure Russia wouldn't mind seeing a rebounding Yugoslavia. After such, we may even see them annex Bulgaria and parts of Albania, if not the whole thing, leaving a strong Eastern Bloc and fulfilling Putin's dreams. And in doing so, NATO will likely collapse in on itself, unable to stand up to any more of their enemies. Now, in the East, or rather in Asia, we can expect China to take a massive amount of land from India. In doing so, they also likely annex Nepal and Bhutan, expanding Bangladesh, binding Pakistan close to them, and also, well, like previously mentioned, cutting India down to size to further cripple their main enemy in the region. North Korea is likely to reunite the peninsula. The Indochina region is firmly under Chinese influence. Taiwan is to, well, be given back to the CCP. Mongolia is likely annexed by the CCP. And likely Japan's islands nearby South Korea and Taiwan are to be annexed by the CCP. While in the Middle East, Iraq likely seizes the coast of, well, Saudi Arabia and further gets control over the Persian Gulf, not just annexing parts of Saudi Arabia, but also Qatar and the UAE, while expanding Transjordan. Whatever remains of Saudi Arabia is a likely puppet of the Iraqi regime. After that, we have Oman and Yemen, which are likely to fall under Iraqi influence. In doing so, the world has fallen under the rule of the Eastern Alliance, and the Western Alliance has permanently dissolved, leaving no one to stop them in their tracks of expansion apart from a nuclear war with the Americas. And in doing so, Gore has practically fucked over the Earth. NATO could win this conflict, but I find it rather unlikely. But if they do, we see Kaliningrad being annexed by, well, Lithuania. We see Transnistria annexed by Moldova. Russia forced to return all their land to a, well, newly democratic Ukraine, which also eats some, well, more land. Finland might actually gain more land from the Russians. Azerbaijan is basically crippled, and now Armenia gets to take over the role that they had over them. The rest of Russia, instead of turning into an oligarch dictatorship like our timeline, is likely turned into a, well, democratic republic with Putin completely deposed. Iraq is rather completely eaten by all of its neighbors in order to prevent such a thing from happening again, and we might actually see a Kurdish state be born into the world, which likely drives some divisions within Turkey and NATO, but it's likely to happen due to the fact that the Kurdish people are a thorn in Saddam's butt. Meanwhile, in Asia, India regains a large majority of the land they lost, and so does Vietnam. While North Korea is annexed into the south, Mongolia might actually gain some lands from the CCP, though not anything major. Those are what I think are the downsides of a Gore presidency. The lack of a foreign policy scene ensures a revanchist Iraq, a revanchist Russia, which has little to no NATO to stand in its way, and in doing so can easily expand into Eastern Europe while NATO just twiddles their thumbs, and China acts more boldly, seeing the lack of a Western response to Russia or Iraq's expansion. Now, I could be very wrong here, and instead Gore goes balls off the walls and actually decides to play his full hand, stopping Iraq in its tracks, deciding to, well, continue the spread of NATO, and also standing up to China. But with Gore, who is incredibly dovish on foreign policy, apart from something like Israel, I find this incredibly unlikely. Not to mention, America will be completely humiliated as the thing he is primarily focused on, being Afghanistan, will still go down as a failure. There is simply no way for either Bush or, well, any US president to actually win Afghanistan, no matter how much focus they press on it, as long term guerrilla warfare will always bite you in the ass. But regardless, Gore, even if he does win the war in Afghanistan, has absolutely no way to recover on the world stage with a rising Russia, a rising Iraq, and a rising China all at once, which are likely to work together to achieve global hegemony. I will not hide I am very biased on this subject, as I am a huge Bush fan. If you are a watcher on my channel, then you probably already know that. But regardless, it is still very likely that these problems Bush face are, well, again, repeated with Gore. And since, again, Gore is a more dovish foreign policy man, it's very likely that he doesn't follow the same role Bush did and change to a more foreign policy president. Not to mention, thing I've neglected to mention so far is that where Bush had his AIDS program in Africa, Gore likely doesn't do the same thing, leading to AIDS killing many more people in Africa as a result. Now, maybe I'm wrong on this. Like I previously stated, maybe after 9/11, Gore does go balls to the walls and attacks Iraq, goes after Russia and expands NATO, and stands up to China. But with his track record of being a dove, I hardly see that as possible, and he likely lets these nations completely roll over him and establish their new world order. But all of that aside, this video is coming to an end. I thank you people for watching. Remember, this is just my point of view on things and shouldn't be taken as, well, the objective fact on how all of this would go down. I probably got a lot wrong here. I'm basically just guessing off of the stuff that went off on our timeline and what didn't. But at the end of the day, this is what I think would have happened had Gore gotten into office instead of Bush. While he would have been better internally, externally, he would have fucked up the world stage and likely caused World War III, which we would have lost, establishing an Eastern Alliance hegemony over the world. But that's enough rambling. I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye bye.